Good morning, church. Happy Memorial Day. I want to share a word with you from 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to begin in verse 8. But before I begin to read, let me sort of share the key word for today. The key word is essential. Last Friday, I was listening to 1090 AM. And the radio station is a talk radio, local talk radio, and I was listening to a program by Eurypsy Morgan, and she has that program from like 1 to 4, and on a daily basis. But anyway, what surprised me about that program, is that Eurypsy was talking about the word essential, and she was using it, of course, relative to COVID-19. And she also used it relative to churches. And the discussion was whether churches were really essential. And she compared the church to Home Depot or any other places, other businesses that were open and those that were not, and why the church had not been considered as essential in the very beginning. And of course, I resonated with that. I love that. But what I want to talk to you about today is not so much whether the church is essential, but is God essential in your life? So I begin in verse 8, reading to the letter, from the letter of Corinthians by Paul. He says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. You also must help us by prayer." The first thing that struck me about this word that the Apostle Paul gives to the church at Corinth is that in the 8th verse, he says, we don't want you to be unaware. And then he shares with them that life was so hard for him in Ephesus, we think, that he despaired of life itself. In other words, the Apostle Paul thought he was going to die. And that's past tense. So why is Paul sharing something in the past with the church at Corinth? What would be the purpose? You would say, well, that's just going to discourage the church. Why would Paul share something that happened in the past with the people? He says, I don't want you to be unaware of this. And then he gives the spiritual purpose that God has revealed to him. He says, this was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. In other words, Paul says that he asked God why this happened. He sought the spiritual reason behind it, and God gave it. Paul was relying too much on himself. And it makes me wonder whether you and I rely too much on ourselves as well. Struggles come into our lives, whether it's the COVID-19 or whatever it might be. And we ask God why. Well, Paul says the reason why this came into his life is so that God would reveal to him that he was too dependent on self. In fact, you would even say that the Apostle Paul had made self-reliance an idol. And what God had to do was reveal it before Paul could remove it, depending upon the Lord. And then what the Apostle Paul says is that once that idol was out of the way, he could now set his hope on God. There are lots of things that we put our trust in other than God. So this passage would say to me this morning, why would Paul make the church aware of a past struggle? It makes you wonder if Paul thought they were relying on themselves and they needed to set their hope on God again. So how essential is God? If we were to follow Paul's advice and counsel today, it would first say that we would share with one another what our struggles are. And then the purpose of Paul sharing that struggle with the people is so that they will also help him by praying with him and for him. That's what the 11th verse says. It says, you also must help us by prayer. So Paul shares the struggle. He shares what he learned from the struggle. He encourages them to put their hope in God, not in their circumstances. And lastly, what he does is he says, you can help us by prayer. So that when God delivers, you and I can all be blessed in the comfort of knowing that when we place our hope in an essential God, he delivers. And then we are comforted together when he does that. Happy Memorial Day, church. God bless you.